Hello everyone, this is video number 1 for the immune system, and in this video I'm going to give you an overview of the immune system, basically how it's organized, and then we'll start going through the different parts of the immune system. So let's take a look at the outline here, and what's in red is what I'm planning to cover in this video, and in following videos I'll cover the rest of this, and also there's a second page to this outline as well. Okay, so let's start with some overview of the different types of immune system cells and where they are located. And this is going to mesh with the previous chapter, the lymphatic system, a little bit, because the locations are mostly the lymphatic organs. And so the locations are on the next slide. So let's go through the types of cells first. So there are the T cells and the B cells, or lymphocytes. And these are cells, these are critical cells in what's called the adaptive immunity. And we'll go through them towards the end of this chapter. There are also the macrophages. These are the most common type of phagocytic cells. So these are patrolling through most tissues in the body, and they're going to engulf pathogens and other cell particles for ruptured cells or damaged cells. There's a particular type of cell called natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are also patrolling the body, and they're able to detect abnormal body cells. Two really good types, which are detected by natural killer cells, and then they kill the cells, hence the name, are virus-infected cells and cancerous cells. Another cell type are the dendritic cells. The dendritic cells are mostly in places where immune surveillance is going on, and they're sort of mixed with B and T cells. These are also phagocytic cells, but their function is to phagocytize materials and then take bits of what they broke down, let's say a bacterium, and present it to other immune cells, and that's going to trigger those immune cells to mount an immune defense. Finally, there are the mast cells. These cells are in tissues, and they're filled with chemicals. They're called pro-inflammatory chemicals. And if you get an infection or tissue damage, they release these chemicals, and that causes a storm of what's called the inflammatory response, which is part of your immune response. All right, so those are the main types of cells. As far as their locations, they are present in the bloodstream, many of them, and we'll break down these types of cells. These are the leukocytes. They circulate in the blood, they take up residence in the tissues. And for example, the lymphatic tissues that we talked about in the last chapter, lymph nodes, spleen, tonsils, malt, are chock full of these immune system cells. They also are patrolling through select organs, especially the macrophages. And if they encounter any kind of pathogen or some kind of agent, they're going to take them in and break them down. Dendritic cells are common in the linings of the body, the mucosal membranes that open to the exterior. So these are vulnerable spots in the body for pathogens to enter. Dendritic cells are phagocytic. If they find something that shouldn't be there, a bacterium, they'll take it in, break it down, and they're going to present those to other immune cells. And the mast cells are scattered throughout connective tissues in the body, and especially those in mucosal membranes. And they're going to sound the alarm by releasing those chemicals, the pro-inflammatory chemicals that I mentioned earlier. All right, this slide presents an overview of the immune system. And I'm going to go through this slide, but first of all, let's take a look at a video, that short video that I made kind of describing the overview. Hello, this is the first video for the immune system. The immune system goes with the lymphatic system. Part of the function of the lymphatic system is to provide places in the body for the immune system cells to take up residence and perform immune surveillance. and immune response. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about how surveillance and response is carried out. First of all, your immune system is protecting you against infectious organisms that can invade and cause you problems, pathogens that cause pathology. And so these fit a number of different categories in terms of type of organism. So just to go down the different types here, viruses, an example of that. I'm pretty sure you've heard about this example recently. And this is the main reason I'm talking to you by video, right? But there's a long list of different viruses, and same for bacteria, a long list of these. Strep is an example of that. There are fungi that can invade and cause problems. Yeast is an example of that, a yeast infection, or athlete's foot is another example. There are protozoans, so these are single-cell eukaryotic organisms that can invade. A giardia is an example of that, and you get a giardia infection from drinking water, let's say on a camping trip. That's why you recommend to boil your water before you drink it. Parasites are multicellular eukaryotic organisms that can infect. So for example, tapeworm and hookworm. All right, so your immune system is built to identify these, first of all, as infectious organisms, not normal parts of the body, and then mount a response against them to try to get rid of them, kill them, inactivate them, protect you in general, okay? How does the immune system work? So I'm going to present an overview in this video, and we're going to build on this as we go through the chapter. Two main types of immunity you have: innate immunity and adaptive immunity. They complement each other. They're not separate. They do kind of cooperate and overlap in many ways, but for now, let's kind of talk about them as distinct and how they work, basically. So I've listed 5 different properties, and we're going to go through this chart and talk about, do these properties fit innate immunity or adaptive immunity? So first of all, are you born with this type of immunity? Well, the word innate means inborn. So for innate immunity, yes, you are born with this type of immunity. So this is stuff you're born with, you're equipped with at birth, and it includes things that are kind of obvious, like your skin is a barrier, but also things less obvious, like internal defenses that you have, at birth. Okay? Adaptive immunity, you're not born with. And this develops over time and upon exposure to different pathogens. Okay, so you don't have it at the beginning, but if you're exposed to something, you're going to develop an immunity to whatever you're exposed to. Second property, is it specific to a given pathogen? Innate immunity is not. It's a non-specific type of immunity. Whereas adaptive immunity is specific to the pathogen. And that's the power of the adaptive immunity. If you're exposed to something, then the response is going to target that specific pathogen. What is the speed of response? For innate immunity, it's a rapid response. Kind of a natural type of response to some kind of pathogen entering into the body. For adaptive immunity, it's a little bit complicated. So the first time you're exposed, the response is pretty slow. Your innate immunity is sort of doing the job. And then over a period of time, your adaptive immunity comes on board and is able to participate as well. But if you're exposed to that pathogen again, the adaptive immunity is much more rapid. So I will say this: the first exposure is relatively slow. Any subsequent exposure is faster. Okay? Does the immunity have memory to a pathogen? What in the world is memory? So memory means if you're exposed to a pathogen once, your immune system responds at a certain rate and a certain, degree, put it that way. What if you're exposed to it a second time? Is this immune system response more vigorous and faster the second time you're exposed to a particular pathogen? That's what memory is. If you have memory, then you mount a much more vigorous and faster response. So memory is not a feature of innate immunity, but it is one of the key features of adaptive immunity. Final property, is the response local or systemic? Local meaning confined to a particular part of the body. Systemic is body-wide. And I put the qualifier here usually. So usually innate immunity mounts a local response. For example, if you get a cut and an infection at the cut, innate immunity will be responding to that site, okay? Adaptive immunity can also respond to a particular site, but the effects are going to happen body-wide. So innate immunity is mostly local. Adaptive immunity is a systemic response. Okay? Now there are exceptions to this, and we'll go through those, and that's why I put the qualifier usually in there. But that's a pretty good picture of the differences between these two types of immunity that take place in an immune response. All right. Okay, so with that background overview, let's talk about this slide, which shows in chart style what the organization of the immune system is. So it breaks it down into innate and adaptive immunity, and then each of those are further broken down. So innate immunity is made up of basically barriers for entry into the body. So these are tissues which define inside versus outside of the body. The skin and the mucosal membranes. So skin is covering the outside of your body, and mucosal membranes are lining passageways that exit to the exterior. Okay, and then the other part of innate immunity is this non-specific internal defenses. So if you get through this barrier, and this is oftentimes referred to as the first line of defense, then you encounter these internal non-specific defenses. And these non-specific defenses can be further broken down into different types of cells, different types of chemicals, and those would include proteins, and some responses as well. The main type of response is called the inflammatory response. The adaptive immune system can also be broken down, and there are two main subcategories under that main category. And that is through the action of the T lymphocytes, they carry out what's called cell-mediated immunity, or the B lymphocytes, which carry out humoral immunity, humoral referring to the action of antibodies in the body humors, the blood, and lymph mostly. Okay, and the B lymphocytes are involved in making cells called plasma cells, which are the actual cells that make the antibodies. So we'll talk about this in the second half, and our target in the first half is mostly going to be this innate immunity. All right, so innate immunity is things that you're born with that are natural defenses, and they include barriers such as skin and mucosal membranes and nonspecific internal molecular defenses or cellular defenses. Innate immunity, as I mentioned in the introductory video, doesn't require previous exposure. It responds immediately, basically similar response every time, and it's mostly a local response at a site of infection. So the first line of defense are the physical barriers, the skin and the mucosal membranes. This is the first line because any kind of pathogen would have to get across these barriers in order to establish an infection. right? So the skin and the mucosal membranes are marking the barrier between the inside and the outside of the body. The physical barriers, therefore, and also included in that are any secretions from these barriers, are part of the first line of defense. Okay? The second line of defense are things that are internal, that are non-specific. And those mostly include different types of cells, including neutrophils, macrophages, and NK cells, which are the natural killer cells. Different types of chemicals, and these include proteins, for example, interferon and complement proteins, but also chemicals involved in the inflammatory response. And the main processes that are involved are inflammation, the inflammatory response, and fever. Okay, so let's go through the first line of defense first thing, and then we'll tackle the second line of defense. All right, so this slide is from the textbook and showing the first line of defense, and it's showing the barriers, skin, and mucosal membranes. Remember that the mucosal membranes are lining passageways such as respiratory tract, digestive tract, urinary and reproductive tracts. Okay, so there are all kinds of secretions from these. It's not just the barrier that's important, but secretions that are also protective and provide defense. So, for example, tears, lacrimal glands secrete tears. And this has lysozyme, which is an enzyme which can degrade bacteria cell walls. Saliva also has lysozyme. Both of these have antibodies as well. IgA is a type of antibody. Okay, so they're equipped with those. Structures in the nasal cavity, hairs, for example, and the mucosal membrane, which secretes mucus. Mucus can trap potentially infectious agents. Right, so many of these secretions, another one is stomach acid, which is very harsh and hostile to any kind of pathogen. So all of these, any of these secretions from the skin or the mucosal membranes that help to protect the body are considered part of the first line of defense. First line of defense is designed, I guess you could say, to keep stuff out, to prevent internalization of a pathogen. Okay, so for the skin, the dermis and the epidermis, it's a very difficult barrier to penetrate. Also, the skin, through secretions such as sweat, can secrete all of these antimicrobial substances. Another feature of the skin is it also has normal bacteria growing on it. And those have to inhibit or slow down any kind of pathogen from growing on the surface of the skin. As far as the mucosal membranes, the main way that they're effective as far as secretions, they're also an effective barrier, but secretion is mucus. Mucus is a very thick, gooey substance, which is really good at trapping and immobilizing substances, preventing them from getting into the body. So I'm going to end this video here, and in the next video, I'll pick up with the second line of defense, which is non-specific internal defenses. See ya.